Good morning. I want to go back a couple of lines. We're on Daf Nun Hey on the base, and we rushed through the last couple of lines by the last blot. So I'd like to go back a couple of lines. The Gemara is discussing the subject of a city that's in the shape of a horseshoe. The Gemara calls it a keshes, like a boat. And the Gemara uses the word mesar as a string, which would be the string of the bow. And although the city is in the shape of a U and the area in the middle is not inhabited at all, the Gemara tells us a chiddush that as long as the two sides of the horseshoe-shaped city are still within 4,000 amas, we put our bowstring, or we put an imaginary line across from leg to leg of this arch, of this horseshoe, and the area in the middle, the empty area, will be considered part of the city. So that when you measure the 2,000 amas of the tchum, you measure it from this imaginary bowstring. And the Gemara says that as this bow gets wider and wider, the area in between the two legs of the bow, or horseshoe, are no longer within 4,000 amas of each other. So that's considered out of the city. But from the point where the two sides are close enough that they're within 4,000 amas of each other, from that point and back, we say it's considered part of the city as if it was built up there. And then the Gemara has another shiloh. And that's the shiloh that I want to review today. And that is there a maximum distance allowed from the actual bow to the bowstring? So this line over here, is there a maximum distance? So there was one sheet in the Gemara that we're going to learn as a review, that the maximum distance from here to here is 2,000 amas. Because once it's more than 2,000 amas, we say that this string here is not accessible from people in the city, in the actual bow. But I think it was Rabbi Bar Chana, we'll see inside, said that even if from here to here is more than 2,000 amas, it doesn't matter. Because people standing here can still get to this. They might not be able to get there straight, but they can walk around through the city, through the inhabited area, and come to each end of that imaginary string. And therefore, this is considered accessible. And therefore, as long as the length of that bowstring is less than 4,000 amas, no matter how far it is away from the base of the horseshoe, no matter how many amas it might be, all that area is still considered filled in, and they'll only start measuring the tchum from the bowstring, from that imaginary line that represents the bowstring. And now we'll just review the Gemara inside, and it'll be very, very simple. Zok the Heilige Gemara. The Chama Hava ben Yeser lekeshes. How much is the maximum distance allowed between the bowstring, that imaginary line, lekeshes, and the actual base of the horseshoe, or top of the arch, depending on how you want to call it? Rabbi Barafuna, so it was my mistake, I said Rabbi Barachana. Rabbi Barahuna Amar Alpayim Ama. The maximum distance from the top of the arch to the imaginary string is 2,000 amas. But the Rava Bereda Rabbi Barafuna, Rava the son of Rabbi Barafuna, Amar Filu Yeser Me Alpayim Ama. Even if it's further than 2,000 amas, there's no limitation. And the reason for it, Abai is going to clarify. Amar Abai, Kavose de Rava Bare de Rabba Barafuna Mistabra. It's Mistabra to say, like Rava, who's the son of Rabbi Barafuna, that the distance is unlimited. It doesn't matter how far away the bowstring is from the bow, it's still going to be considered part of the city. Why? Because anybody in the city can still access those strings, the bowstring, the imaginary bowstring, the boy Hader Asa Derech Batam. Because anybody in the city can walk down the arch either side to where the string originates, and then they can get to any part of the string because they can reach the closest 2,000 amas to it on either side, because we already established that string cannot be longer than 4,000 amas. And that's the end of this sugya. Now we're going to get started with another sugya. This sugya is somewhat challenging, not this immediate sugya, but the Gemara on Daf Nun Vav is going to be challenging. So this Gemara here is going to be Gishmak, and then it's going to get a little challenging and technical. So let's start with Hayusham Gududiyos Gavois Asar Tvachim. If there were ruins of houses or structures that were within 70 amas of the city or 70 amas of each other, they extend the range of the city. So the city doesn't necessarily end where the built up area ends, but even if there's ruins further out of the perimeter of the city, they make that area is also still part of the city. My Gedudios, what are these little structures that we're referring to? Zok the Heilige Gemara, Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Shalosh Mechitzos, She'ein Aleim Tikra. There's three walls of a structure, even though it has no covering, no roof. That's considered a significant enough structure that it extends the city limits to include those structures. Iboilu, so the Gemara closes Shaila. What would be if it was Shtei Mechitzos, V'yesh Aleim Tikra? What if you only had two walls, but it had the advantage of the fact that there was a roof over it? Would that be considered significant enough of a structure that we would extend the city to include those structures as well? Zok Gemara Tashma. Our Mishnah says, a brisa, it's a brisa, I apologize, it's not a Mishnah, it's a brisa. Elu shemis abram ima. The following structures extend the city. Miloshin Ibor makes the city pregnant, means it extends the city out to include these structures. Nefesh, sheyesh ba'arbamis. A nefesh, which Rashi tells us is a binyan ala kever. It's a house that's built on top of a kever, like an oil built on top of a kever, and it's normally made to stumble a dearest shomer a kever of it. It's normally made for a human to live there. The person who's watching the kever will stay there. Hilchach avagav d'leidayir bei, even though people don't live there, there's no family living in there. Nevertheless, Beis Dirahu, we consider it a Beis Dira, and we would extend the perimeter of the city to include that nefesh, that oil. Provided sheyesh ba'arba mishal arba amis. It has to be of the appropriate size that we can consider it a dira. Vagesher, a bridge, and it means if there's like a watchtower in a bridge. Vakever, sheyesh bohen Beis Dira, and a caver, and Rashi means a basic forest that has in it some type of home, some type of hut that its caretaker, its attendant lives in. Ubeisa knesses sheyesh ba dir lachazon, or a shul, which again normally a shul is not something that people live in, but if there's like an apartment in there where the custodian would live, that's considered a Beis Dira, even if the basic knesses is out of the city. Ubeis avoidus kechavim, or even if it's a beis avoidus kechavim, sheyesh ba dir lakaimim, where the priests live, or v'haravos, the stables. These are stables. Let me just make sure that I'm pronouncing the word properly. The ArtScroll calls it a uravos. Uravos, so these are stables. The oitris shebesados, and other types of storehouses that are out in the fields. Sheyesh v'yesh one Beis Dira. If these places indeed have a little hut there for an attendant to stay in, little watchtowers, little guard houses that are huts in the field, or little huts that people stay in. If you have a small little island that is a little hut on top of the island, and that island is within 70 amas and a bit of the city, all of these things extend the tchum of the city out to encompass those little huts. And now we're going to get to our raya. The following list is a list of structures that are not included as part of the city. If you have this cover to the caver, a house that's built on top of the caver, that's missing two walls completely, so you only have two walls remaining. And this is where the Gemara is going to bring a raya from, so let's pay attention to this. Or vagesher, vakever she'ein Beis Dira, or any bridge or basic forest that doesn't have a hut in it, or basic knesset she'ein Beis Dira, or shul that doesn't have a place to live, lechazin, or basic kachavim she'ein Beis Dira lekoimim, or v'ravos for oitrish b'sadah she'ein Beis Dira, all of the similar structures that we discussed in the first half of the brisa, but in this case they don't have a Beis Dira. Or bor siach u'ma'ora. Bor is a pit, siach is a ditch, and ma'ora is a cave. The gather, or gate v'shoivach sheb'seicha. or a little coop that's inside a gated area, the abayi shebesfina, the living quarter in the ship. Ein elu misaber mima. Even if that ship is within 70 amas of the shore, it doesn't extend the city up to the boat. They're not included. So the abayi shebesfina, Rashi tells us, is not included because it's not stationary. It could move away, and it could be more than 70 amas. It's not remaining in that one position. Kondonimias. Let's go back to where we want to bring a raya from. You have a structure on the caver that two of its walls are completely missing from end to end. And the Brisa tells us that that is not considered a structure. My love dikatrika. Would you not say that even if it has a roof on it, but since it's completely missing two walls, it's not considered a choshev structure, and therefore it will not extend the city. So this will be a raya to the shah that we had. We had a shah that there's two walls and a roof. So you have a raya that two walls on the roof from our brisa seems to indicate that if it only had two walls, even though it has a roof, it's still not considered a choshev structure and it will not extend the city. Maybe the brisa that says that if it's missing two walls, it doesn't extend the city, is speaking if it didn't have a cover. But maybe if it did have a cover, if it did have a roof, that would still make it a choshev structure. Now let's go back and analyze the brisa and the other things that the brisa mentions. It mentions bayis shabiyam, a little hut that's on an island. Lamai chazi, what would that be used for? Omar Papa, bayis also lifnois by kelim shebesfina. It acts almost like a wharf, like a dock, like a pier, where you could unload your ship, things that you don't need on the ship, you can unload there, and that's why they had those types of things. Then the Brisa says, Uma'ora, one of the things is Barasich and Ma'ora, those are not considered structures that would extend the city. In fact, a cave would not be considered a choshev structure that would extend the city around it. Vatani, we learned, Reb Chia taught us, Ma'ira misaberes ima. A cave does extend the limits of a city. So how could our Brisa suggest that it doesn't? Omar Abaye, kishiyesh binyan al pia. When do you say that a cave extends the city? If it has a house, a structure built on it. Frank Gemara, if it has a house, a structure built on it, then it's not the cave that's extending the perimeter of a city. It's the actual house that does that. The house itself was not dalet al dalet. And you needed to be connected to the cave in order for it to have a dalet al dalet. So the cave is playing a role in being part of the dira of dalet al dalet. So when you have a cave that's connected to a structure that together they're dalet al dalet, that's where you say that we extend the city past the cave. But if it's a cave by itself, without any structure, there you don't extend the city to the cave. Amar Avuna said, Yoshvei tzrifim, people who live in little huts. So let's say you have like a camp of huts. You have a whole bunch of people that are out in the middle of nowhere, and they're all living in their own huts. So do the combination of all the huts make a city? And therefore, we draw an imaginary line around that entire encampment, and that's your dalet amas, and then you can go 2,000 amas from that imaginary line on all four sides? Zokar Avuna, no. If it's an encampment of huts, that's not considered a city. And every hut is for itself. And therefore, if you live in one of these huts, if you're in one of those huts for Shabbos, you have your dalet amas, and from your door, you count 2,000 amas, and that's your tchum. We don't look at the entire hut area, the entire encampment, as one city. Rav Chisda asked the kasha, I'm going to illustrate to you that, in fact, an encampment is considered a city. Because the pasuk in Seder Bamidbar tells us that Yachanu al Hayarden mi beis hayishimus. It's talking about the Machane Yisrael, and it describes one place where the Machane Yisrael was, And we'll read the pasuk inside. This is one of the encampments that Klal Yisrael had, and the Bride teaches us about it. Rabbi Bar Chana said, I saw that place that the Torah describes was one of the camps where Klal Yisrael camped. It happens to be a 3 parsha square. Each parsha is 4 mil. So in fact, it's a 12 mil square. The article tells us that it was actually 8,000 amis by 8,000 amis. So the camp of Klal Yisrael, which only had tents and temporary type of dwellings, was 12,000 amis. I'm sorry, it was 8,000 amis by 8,000 amis. Now, based on what Rav Huna has taught us, any person living in any one of those tents has 2,000 amas that he can travel from his tent. But you don't look at the entire area like one city, and you could walk through that entire 8,000 amas square, and then from the edge of the 8,000 amas square, be able to walk an additional 2,000 amas. That wouldn't be the case, because they were all huts. Yet, Vitanya, we learned in the Brisa, if people in the camp had to relieve themselves, they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom in front of the camp. You know why? Because when the camp heads on and moves forward, the camp is going to have to walk over a gift that you left them. That's not appropriate. And today, you shouldn't relieve yourself at the side of the camp, because if the camp decides to move to the right or to the left, if that's where the Onan leads us, again, we're going to have to walk over a gift that you left us. Behind the camp is where you could relieve yourself. And because we assume that the camp will not go backwards, it'll either go forward, to the right, or to the left. And the problem is, if I live all the way in front of the camp, in order for me to get to the back of the camp, I have to walk almost 8,000 amas. And if the tchum is measured from the doorway of my tent, then I'm walking out of my tchum. I can't even get to the area behind the encampment. So according to Rav Huna, who says that you don't consider an encampment of huts as one big city, how is it that someone was able to walk on Shabbos to behind the machana to relieve themselves if they couldn't even get through the camp itself because they're limited to 2,000 amas from their front door? Omli Rava, Digle Midmar Karmit. You're asking me a kasha from the Digle Midbar, from the encampment of the Eden in the Midbar, to any old encampment that we make nowadays? The encampment in the Midbar was much more significant than a typical camp of huts. Kivan Dichsiv Behu Al Pi Hashem Yachanu, Al Pi Hashem Yisou, who was the Rebbeinu Shalom who dictated when we would travel, when we would encamp, Commanded Kfilu Dami. That encampment that's set aside by the Rebbeinu Shalom, that is considered a permanent camp, and there we would say that the entire camp is your Dalet Amos. But if you just have your own camp that you make somewhere because you're going hiking in the desert, there the camp doesn't count as a city, and every person has his own Dalet Amos from where he has to count 2,000 Amos of his tchum. Amar B'china Bar Kahana, Bar Rav Kahana, Amar Bashi. What if you had 3 sets of homes? So you had 3 chatzeres, and in each chatzer there was a properly built home of stone, of brick, of wood, but a proper house, not a tent. So those 6 homes, those 3 chatzeres that each had 2 homes, hukfu, they establish a city. And if they're surrounded with a whole bunch of little tents, we say that those tents now become part of the city because we already have a core of a real city, of a real structure, and any tents around it would now be included in the perimeter of the city. So this that Rav Huna said that tents don't count, that's only if all there is in the entire camp. But if there's a core of 6 homes in 3 chatzeres, then any tent around it will say will be part of that core city. Or maybe the Marav, Yoshvei Shrifin, people who live in these huts, nomadic type of people, V'holchem Midbaris, and people who travel all the time in the Midbar. And Rashi says that some of these people would graze sheep. They had flocks of sheep, so they would stay in one area until there was no grass left to graze, and then they would move on to a different area. So these types of people, chayeyem einam chayim, they don't have much of a life, and we'll soon see why. Unishem uveneim einam shalem. Their wives, we don't consider theirs because they're hefker, and therefore their children aren't theirs because we don't even know if those children are their children. Tani Nami Hachi, we learned another brisa which will give us a little more insight. Eliezer Ish Baraya Yoshvei Shrifin, people who live in these huts, Ki Yoshvei Kforim. They're like people who live in graves, meaning they're like dead people because they have no life. And Rashi says the reason why they have no life, they really don't have any enjoyment in life. They live outside, subject to the elements, the winds and the rains. That's not a life. And their daughters, the pasuk says, one should not cohabit with a behema, because we consider them to be mamzerim, we consider them to be usher to live with, just like a behema. Why is that? Why do we say that their wives will have relations with others, and we can't assume that their children are really theirs? My time, because they don't have bathhouses. So the men, at least they take showers. When they go to bathe, they have to leave where they are, the entire area, and go to a city. So they're abandoning the women in their camps for extended period of times. Other men are going to come into those camps and seduce those women. And because of that, we assume that the children born to those women aren't even the children of their husbands. And they're mamzer. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, not because the men disappear. It's because whenever the women have to go to the mikveh, they're in the middle of nowhere. They don't want to go by themselves. So they would ask their friends, I have to go to the mikveh. Can you come with me? It's, let's say, an hour walk in the desert. So they wanted someone to come with them. But men would overhear these women talking about going to the mikveh, and the men would follow them and be miyachad with them, and that's where there would be a problem. Maybe now, what's the difference between whether or not these types of people, their children are assumed not to be theirs? What's the difference if it's because the men travel far to bathe, or because the women have to walk an extended period to go to the mikveh? If there was a river that was Mayim Chaim that you could toivel in, but it wasn't appropriate as a bathhouse, so if you had that close by, if the whole chashash is only because women go to the mikveh and people will follow them, here you don't have that chashash because they have a river close by. But if the chashash is because the men have to leave and go far away to Batim Echadzois, that chashash would still apply here. Amar Avuna said, Kol ir she'ein bo yerek. If there's a city that has no access to vegetables, ein Talmud Chacham rishai laderba. A Talmud Chacham may not live in the city without vegetables. Why is that? Vegetables are good to eat; they're healthy, and v'nilkach bezoil, and you could buy them for cheap, and therefore v'yochal asik v'torah. So Rashi is telling us that a Talmud Chacham should only live in a place where life is affordable. If someone wants to learn and not be oisik and parnasa, he has to find a place where the cost of living will be as low as possible, and this way he'll be able to learn undisturbed without having to disturb himself from learning to go earn money because he needs much less to live. Frank the Gemara, remember the Yerek Malya? Are you suggesting that vegetables are healthy? Vatani we learned, Shloisha Marber Nesazeva. There's 3 foods that cause bowel movements. It's funny, nowadays, we look at bran and things that create bowel movements as something that's good. They regulate your digestion. In those days, medicine was probably a little bit more primitive, and those things were considered bad. So there's 3 things that are marbim esazebel, the koivivin is a koimen, cause one to be hunched over, the noitel echad michomish meyosh mimar einov shalodim, and it reduces someone's eyesight by 1 part to 500. These are the 3 foods that we're suggesting, the Bryce suggests, ruin someone's vision, digestive system, and causes them to walk hunched over. Paskeeper, bran bread, which to us today is wonderful. Sheikh Chodesh, fresh beer made out of dates. V'yerek, and vegetables. So you clearly see from this brisa that vegetables are not good for a person. So how could our brisa say, how could you say that a Talmud Chacham should only live where you have access to vegetables? So Rashi, the second shot which he prefers, learns that when do we say vegetables are healthy? Those are tumi, which are garlic, or crazy or leek. Those are 2 healthy vegetables. But Habishayaki, where the Brisa says vegetables cause three harmful things, those are referring to other vegetables. Kidatanya, like we learned a Brisa that indeed says that garlic is good. Shum yerek, garlic is a vegetable, meaning it's a good vegetable. It's something that's good. Krishin, leek, chatzierek, it's like a half a vegetable, meaning it's beneficial, but not as beneficial as garlic. Niratznoin, if you see radish, nirasamachayim, you're actually seeing an unbelievable medicine. So it's saying that radish is very, very good for you. Tanya, we learned niratznoin, nirasamamavis. If you see radish, you're actually seeing poison. So it's not a stira. Kan ba'alan, kan be mois. When do we say that radish is very bad for you? It's a samamavis. Those are the leaves of the radish. When do we say that a radish is healthy for you? It's a samav chayim. That's be moist. It's the bulbs. And can be moist chama, can be moist shama. When are the bulbs healthy? In the summer, because radishes are cool, and when you eat them in hot weather, it cools you down. But be moist shama when you're cold and you're not looking to be cooled down. If anything, you're looking to be warmed up. There, the bulbs are no good. So based on this chat, which is how Rashi learns, radishes are not healthy to be eaten at all in the winter. The problem that Tosfos asks is from the very famous Gemara that says that Antoninus and Rebbe, they were two friends, they were both very wealthy, they always had radish. It says lepasku shochanim, loit snoin, loy chazeres. They always had all year round, in all seasons, they had both radish and mortar, but they had radish. So how could you suggest that they would have radish in the winter if it's not healthy to eat radish in the winter? So because of that, Tosfos says to learn different shot in the Gemara. At different seasons, different part of the radishes are healthy. The bulbs are healthy in the summer; they cool you off, and the leaves are healthy in the winter. Again, we know that aerobic exercise, cardio, is healthy. In those days, it seemed like they didn't think that cardio is healthy. So if you have a city that has a lot of rises and drops, steps to go up and go down, I'm thinking of the city of Yerushalayim. So the fact is that people are going to die young. Are you going to suggest that just because there's a lot of stairs and drops in a city, people are going to die young? They'll age much earlier from all the difficulty of going up and down the stairs. It's funny because current medicine would suggest that walking up and down stairs is healthy for you and would actually keep you vibrant late into your years. The sharp incline on the streets between Beiniri, Beibiri, and Beinarish, Askenun, caused me to age prematurely. Here is where we start getting a little bit technical. Now, the Gemara and Rashi makes things very technical, but if we use our calculator and we use modern math, it tends to simplify the Gemaras that we're about to learn. So I'm going to prepare my calculator so that we could try to get an easier understanding of the sugyas that we're about to learn. So Zok the Gemara. We were learning in our Mishnah about a city that's round. First, you square it off. You make it into a square. So you circumscribe a square around that circle. So, Balarava, if you want to square off a round city, Mirava b'ribuah shalayim. When you make a square, it's basically two sets of two parallel lines, two horizontal and two vertical. Zogt the Brisa, when you make your horizontal and vertical lines, they should be parallel to the x and y axis of the earth, meaning the two vertical lines should go exactly due north and due south, and the two horizontal lines should go due east and due west. And how do you know when you're standing there, if you don't have a compass, how do you know exactly what's the east-west line? And how do you know where's the north and where's the south? The simanech agala b'tzafain va'akriv b'darim. Egla b'tzafain va'akriv b'darim. If you are able to identify the zodiac arrangement of stars in the sky, then you'll know that when you have the Egla in the northern part of the sky and the Akrave, Scorpio, in the southern side of the sky, so then you know where north is and where south is, so you'll know how to align the four lines that are going to be the border, the square border to your city. What if you don't know how to find zodiac symbols? You don't know what you're looking at when you're looking up in the sky. I'm going to give you an easier, simpler way that the average person can use to know where the east-west lines are. You use the sunrise and sunset based on the seasons to tell you what the east-west line is. Ketzat, how does that work? Everyone knows in the summer, all year long, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But in the summer, the sun tends to rise on the northern part of the eastern horizon. And in the winter, the sun rises on the southern part of the eastern horizon. In the summer, the sun sets again on the northern part of the western horizon. And the sun sets in the winter on the southern part of the western horizon. So Ketzat, on a long summer day, the sun rises, and it sets on a long day. That would be tzofan. Meaning, if you look at the point where the sun comes up over the horizon in the summer, and you look at the point where the sun sets over the western horizon in the summer, and you draw a virtual line from that point to that point, you'll have your east-west line that will be the northern border of your city. Or if you want to know where the south is, look at where the sun rises and sets in the winter. That will be the southern part of the hemisphere, and that would be your southern line that runs east-west. Kuvas Nisan, it's Kuvas Tishrei. What about during what we call the equinox, the time of the year where the day and night are of equal length? Then Chama Yoytze B'Chatzi Mizrach, V'Shekas B'Chatzi Ma'ariv. There the sun rises in the center of the eastern horizon and sets in the center of the western horizon. Shenemar, like it says in the pasuk, Hoylech El Doran, the sun rises in the summer in the east on the northern part of the horizon, and the sun moves towards the south, because we know when we stand outside in the summer, if we look to the north, we won't see the sun. If we look to the south, we'll see the sun. So the sun rises in the northern part of the eastern horizon. It travels to the south. Now, it's not really traveling to the south. Our Earth is spinning. But from our perspective, it looks like the sun is traveling to the south. The Soviv al Tzafon, and then it goes to the south. It comes back around, and it goes up the western horizon, and it sets at the northern side of the western horizon. Hoylech el Dorim b'yoyim. It goes to the south by day. So again, you have this sun that's rising at the northeast. It's traveling towards the south. The Soviv el Tzafon b'layla, and it goes down and back up and sets on the west side, the northern west side by night. It goes around and around. Elu pnei mizrach upnei ma'ariv. This pasuk is referring to the eastern horizon and to the western horizon. Sometimes, like in the summer, the sun actually goes down the eastern horizon, goes across the southern horizon, and goes up the western horizon, and then it sets. But in the winter, it just rises in the south and sets in the south. So when it's going back around, that's behind our horizon. That's behind our Earth. So from our perspective, the sun is going underneath the Earth and coming back around again. And it's not doing the long trip, going south, west, and north again. Amar Rabbi Sharsha, less milhalachlali. I don't believe in all these chol, because the Tanya we learned in the Brisa, the sun does not rise in the northernmost point of our eastern horizon. Sure, it's the north side of the eastern horizon, but it's not the northernmost points. That never happened. The sun never rises so far to the north. The shaka bekaren meravas, and neither does the sun ever set at the northernmost point of the western horizon. And in the winter, the sun never rises at the southernmost point of our eastern horizon. The shaka bekaren meravas, and it doesn't set at the southernmost point of the western horizon. So therefore, I don't believe in your shot on the pasuk. And just to use the Archgross diagrams to explain this, the first shot, and who said the first shot? It was Rabbi Yosy. Rabbi Yosy said that the point where the sun rises in the summer to the point where the sun rises in the winter, that small area is the eastern horizon. And the point where it sets in the summer to the point where it sets in the winter is also going to be the western horizon. So it creates sort of a rectangle in our total 360-degree scope. But Rabbi Shaisha learned differently. He said, no, our scope is a square. You could see much further north, much further south. There's a brick square that our horizon is, that our graph would be in, our chessboard, so to speak. The sun only rises lower down, but our horizon is bigger. And therefore, I don't like the pshat that you learned in the pasuk that says that the sun goes down the entire eastern horizon and climbs up the entire western horizon, because it doesn't. Now we're getting into a complicated Gemara that analyzes astronomy. And I'll try to keep it as simple and as easy as possible. Omar Shmuel. Ein tekufas Nisan unefelas, ela ba'arba revoy hayoim. The new season, we know there's 4 seasons. There's the solstice and the equinox. And what that means is as follows. The equinox is the spring season that begins in Nisan, and it's when the day and the night are 12 hours. There's the equinox in Nisan, and 6 months later, there's the equinox in Tishrei, again, when the day is 12 hours and the night is 12 hours. When we get deep into the summer, the center of the summer, at that point, that's called the Tammuz Tkufa. That's when you have the longest day and the shortest night. That's called solstice, Soltice. And the Sotu in the dead of winter, where the day is the shortest it is, that's called the winter solstice. So there are these 4 seasons. So Zok the Gemara, Zok Shmuel, ain't Kuvas Nisan Nefelas. Every year when the summer equinox, the spring equinox arrives, which is the Kuva of Nisan, when it arrives, it's always going to happen at 4 possible times in the day. It will only happen in one of the 4 times of the day. So let's split the day. Let's call it 6 p.m., midnight, 6 a.m., noon. So either Nisan, the Kuva of Nisan will start at 6 p.m., or it'll start at midnight, or it'll start at 6 a.m., or it'll start at noon. So ein tkufas Nisan nefelas ala ba'arba revei hayoim, oy b'tchilas hayoim, oy b'tchilas halayla, either 6 a.m. or 6 p.m., oy b'chatze hayoim, or noon, oy b'chatze halayla, or midnight. And Rashi tells us how you get to this calculation. And it's quite simple. The solar year, according to Shmuel, there's others who are arguing we don't pass like Shmuel, it's actually a drop off from what Shmuel said. But Shmuel says it's 365 days and 6 hours. Every year is 365 days and 6 hours. So based on that, it's very simple to understand. If Nisan started today at 6 p.m., next year, when Nisan arrives, since the solar calendar is 365 days and 6 hours, so when Nisan comes next, it's going to be pushed 6 hours forward. So if Nisan this year starts at 6 p.m., the next year, Nisan is going to start at midnight. And the year after, it'll start at 6 a.m. And the year after, it'll start at noon. Very, very simple. Now, we know what is the tkufa that comes after Nisan? Tammuz. Tammuz is the summer solstice. That's one season later. We know, Rashi tells us, that every season is 91 days, 7.5 hours. And the calculation is very, very simple. If I divide 365, well, actually, we'll do it differently. We know a year is 365 days, 6 hours. That's 365 and a quarter. So let's try dividing that by 4. 365.25, which represents 1 year in hours, so 1 year in days. If I divide it by 4, what I get is 91.3125, which is 0.3125 is 7.5 hours. So it's 91 days, 7.5 hours. So if I start measuring, let's say the Tkufa of Nisan, I started Tuesday night at 6 p.m. If I count 91 days, let's see what it works out. I count 91 days, and now I'm at 6 p.m. But I have to add 7.5 hours to it because it's 91 days, 7.5 hours. So if the Tkufas Nisan started at 6 p.m., let's count 7.5 hours from 6 p.m. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 1:30. That means if Nisan start at 6 p.m., then Tammuz will start at 1:30 in the morning. And then and if Nisan falls out 6 hours later, then Tammuz will fall out 6 hours later. But whenever Nisan falls out, Tammuz will fall out 7.5 hours later. So therefore it says, if Nisan fell out at night, let's say Tuesday night at 6 p.m., then when Tammuz starts, it's going to be 7.5 hours later. So that's 1:30 in the morning. Or if Nisan started at midnight, then Tammuz would start Shavu Mechza, 7:30 in the morning. And this works by night and by day because Nisan could be 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. and Nisan could be noon or midnight. 7.5 hours later is when the Tkufa of Tammuz would start. So we're not dealing with the day of the week, we're just dealing with the hours in the day. And the same thing with Tishrei. Tishrei is going to be 7.5 hours later than whatever the Tkufa of Tammuz fell out on. And Tkufas Tishrei nefelas ala oy b'shalosh shayis, oy b'tesha shayis, which basically are 7.5 hours past the time that the Tkufa of Tammuz started. Bein b'yoy, ubein b'layla. And going to the fourth Tkufa of Teves, bein Tkufas Teves nefelas, ala oy b'arbu mechza, oy b'eseru mechza, bein b'yoy, ubein b'layla. So basically, whenever Nisan starts, Tammuz will be 7.5 hours later, Tishrei will be 7.5 hours after that, and Tevis will be 7.5 hours after that. Ve'ein ben tkufa l'tkufa ela tishim ve'echa join v'sheva shoyis u'mechza. And the length of each tkufa, of each of the 4 seasons, are 91 days, 7.5 hours, and we figured that out by taking 365 days and 6 hours, which is 365.25, and we divide it by 4, and we get 91 days, 7.5 hours. So that's the first part of the Gemara. And now we're going to bring in another dimension. And the other dimension that we're going to bring in is the zodiac system. So we need to know that all stars, when you look up into the heaven, if you know your astronomy, which I don't, all stars will always be in the same position relative to each other. So if you know where the Big Dipper is and you know where the North Star is, you'll always be able to know where everything is related to everything else. The only thing that changes is that there's a set of zodiac symbols, and those are called planets. And those planets are not fixed to the same backdrop of the stars. They move independently from the stars. And they actually move in a 7-hour cycle. Now, the Rashi tells us that there's 7 zodiac symbols that we deal with. And it's as follows. Chof stands for Koichev, which the ArtScroll tells us is Mercury. Lamed stands for Levana, which is the moon. Shin stands for Shapsi, which is Saturn. Tzadik stands for Tzedek, which is Jupiter. Mem stands for Madim, which is Mars. Ches stands for Chama. And Nun stands for Noiga, which is Mercury. I'm sorry, which is Venus. There's three planets that are missing, and those are Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And the ArtScroll tells us that those planets are not part of this zodiac because they're not visible with the naked eye. You need a telescope. So in this cycle of 7, Rashi tells us that when the world was created, they're sort of put on a ribbon that goes around the Earth. And if you look at which one of these planets are visible on the horizon, that's the hour of that planet. So if coming over the horizon is the planet of Mercury, then it's called that the world is now under the influence of the planet of Mercury. An hour later, after the Mercury is further up in the sky, the next planet that we're under the influence of, Dr. Rashi, looking at the sequence of events, is Lamed, which is Levana. Then comes the moon. Then we're under the influence of the moon. And then an hour later, it's going to be under influence of Shin, which is Shapsi, which is Saturn. So at the end of the day, every 7 hours, the same mazel is there. So every 7 hours, you're going to have Mercury. Every 7 hours, you're going to have the moon. Every 7 hours, you're going to have Saturn. Every 7 hours, you're going to have Jupiter. Every 7 hours, you're going to have Mars. Every 7 hours, you're going to have the sun. And every 7 hours, you're going to have, I believe it is, the last one is Noiga's Venus. Right? Every 7 hours, you're going to have each one of those. So it's a cycle of 7 hours. So what we want to see is, how does that cycle of 7 hours fit in with our seasonal cycle of 91 days, 7.5 hours? So Zok Shmuel, Varma Shmuel, I'm sorry, I skipped. We have Ein Kufa, Mosheches Mechaberta El Chatisha. If Kufa number 1 starts at the beginning of a mazel, so let's say Kufa number 1 starts when the moon is there, at the beginning of its hour, then the next Kufa is going to be offset by a half hour. And how is that? Very, very simple. We can figure this out. Because in order for everything to be equal, in other words, in order for every season to start at the same time as a mazel starts, it has to be divisible by 7. So that we're actually at the beginning. If we start one season at the beginning of a mazel, if the hours are divisible by 7, then we're also going to start the next mazel at the beginning of 7. So let's figure this out. 91 days and 7.5 hours. So let's see how many hours are in the 91 days, 7.5 hours. So what I'm going to do is 91 times 24 is 2,184. That's how many hours there are in 91 days. I have to add to it 7.5 hours. So I'm only going to add to it 7 hours. 2184 plus 7 is 2191. Now, if 2191 is divisible by 7, then if one mazel starts, if one kufa starts at the beginning of a mazel, then the next one will start at the beginning of a mazel, because it's exactly divisible by 7 hours. So let's do 2191 divided by 7. It's an even number, 313 without a remainder. That means that at exactly 91 7 hours, at exactly 91 days and 7 hours, the next, if Nisan started, if Tkufas Nisan started at the beginning of a mazel, the 91 days and 7 hours again will be the beginning of that mazel. But the problem is, we said each tkufa is 91 and 7.5 hours. So there's an extra half hour that's unaccounted for. So because of that, since the kufa lasts a half hour longer than an even mazel, it comes out that if Nisan started at the beginning of the mazel, then when Tammuz starts, it's going to be halfway through whatever mazel it's up to, which is going to be the next mazel. So if it started off with the mazel of Mercury, next next season, which will be Tammuz, will start when Mercury is already a half hour in to its reign and it's halfway done. And that's what the Gemara meant. Each new season is going to be pushed off by a half hour because the mazel that arrives is going to be a half hour into it already because it's divisible by 7 with a half hour remainder. Shmuel told us another halacha. Now, this next thing that Shmuel says, if you master it, then you'll be able to make money in the commodity markets. But Shmuel tells us, you'll never have a case where the beginning of the spring equinox, the summer, the Nisan season, if it falls out with tzedek we said is Jupiter. If the mazel of Jupiter is corresponding to the beginning of the Nisan season, it's going to cause havoc in agriculture. It's going to destroy the trees. So if that happens, you'd be well advised to purchase futures for these trees because they're going to be scarce. The Ein Lach Kufas Teves, and you'll never have that the winter season starts when it corresponds to the mazel of Jupiter, where it will not dry out the seeds again, food will be scarce. However, there's one more condition that has to be met in order for this to be a bad sign. That is the Yalid Levana, Oy Belevana, Oy Besedek. That only also happens if there's one more condition. When Nisan or Tevis starts, it has to be under the mazel of Jupiter, and whenever the moilad is for that month, at the time of the moilad, the mazel in action has to be either Levana or Jupiter. If those two things occur simultaneously, the season starts with Jupiter, and the moilad is either when the moon is in force or Jupiter is in force, if those two things happen at the same time, same year, same season, that will be a very bad year for trees and Zroim. And with that, we'll end this sugya. And now that we finished the astronomy sugya, we're going to go back into a geometry sugya. When you learn these Gemaras, you sometimes regret that you didn't work hard enough when you were in high school to understand the subjects taught there. But for those of you who didn't master geometry, this Gemara will be a breeze. Now, if you look at this daf, which is Nunvavim at Beis, you see a long, intimidating Rashi. Now, unfortunately, from the Gemara and from Rashi, you see that they didn't have some of our simple mathematical formulas. So they had to figure out things that are simple for us to do with the computer or the calculator. They had to use estimates to figure them out, which complicates it. I'm going to learn this Gemara using simple mathematics and our rules of geometry. That's going to make things quite simple. And I'll point out how the Gemara is relying on generalizations to teach us the same thing, but that leads to a much more complicated calculation, which we don't have to work with because we have accurate mathematical formulas. Tana Rabbanan, Hamar Be'Sa'ir, which means you have a round city, and we know for the purpose of Eruvin, you circumscribe a square around the round city, meaning you're actually expanding the city from a smaller circle to fill up a whole square. And that's going to be the base city from which you measure the 2,000 amas of the Tchum. So Zok de Braisa, Oisa Kimin Tabla Murabas, you make the city square. V'choizer umar be'esat tchumen. And then when you add the 2,000 amas all the way around it, you also do that in a square fashion. Oison Kimin Tabla Murabas. And you make it a square. So I'm going to tell you the maskana, and then we'll go through the steps. So the maskana is very simple. You draw you have your circular city, you draw your square around the city. So there's your city now, which is a Tavla Murubas. Then you measure 2,000 amas to the left of the western wall, to the right of the eastern wall, or to the east of the eastern wall, to the south of the southern wall, to the north of the northern wall, and then you extend these four lines until they intersect with each other, and that's your Tchum Shabbos. Very, very simple. Zok the Brisa. So I told you what you're supposed to do. Now I'm going to tell you what you're not supposed to do. If you measure lo yimdoid me'emta karen al payim amma, when you're measuring the 2,000 amas, don't measure it off on a diagonal. Don't measure 2,000 amas diagonally. You need to measure 2,000 amas direct, straight, perpendicular to your wall, not diagonally away from your wall. Don't measure it on a diagonal, because you're going to lose your corner. And I'll explain that in a minute. And then maybe tabla merubas, you bring a square, and you put it on the corner, so let me show you what you do. When you measure your 2,000 amas, Zok the Gemara, don't measure 2,000 amas diagonally. Because if you measure 2,000 amas diagonally, it's not going to go nearly as far as if you would measure it straight out. And let's see how much you're going to lose. So let's have a look. If you measure 2,000 amas diagonally, the way you lose is very simple. We have a rule called the Pythagorean Theorem. It means whenever you have a right triangle, if you take the two sides that are perpendicular to each other, and then you have the diagonal side, which is called the hypotenuse. So in this case, this diagonal section of the square is the hypotenuse, and these two sides are the two sides. So if the hypotenuse is going to be 2,000 amas, we have a rule. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So if I have an hypotenuse that is 2,000 amas, and then I have a square. So if this line was 2,000 amas, and then I have these two sides of the square, let's see how long this will be. Let's see how long this will be. So if the hypotenuse is 2,000 amas, let's see if we can get the square root of 2,000. So I'm going to figure that out. Square root, using my handy dandy calculator, 2,000. Oh, I got to clear this out. Square root 2,000 equals, the square root of 2,000 is, oh, I apologize. It's A squared times B squared equals C squared. So it's 2,000 squared. So let's do that again. 2,000, what I'm going to do to make it simple, instead of using 2,000, I'm going to use 2. So I'm going to use 2 for 2,000. So 2 times 2 is 4. So what's the square root of 4? So we'll do the square root of 4. Square root of 4 equals 2. So if the square root of 4 is 2, we know A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So that means we need to get two equal numbers that if you square them and you add them to each other, they'll reach 2. So let's think. What is the square root of 2? So let's have a look. The square root of 2 is 1.414. 1.414 is the square root of 2, which means that if I measure 2,000 amas to the point, then instead of having 2,000 amas out from the wall, I only have 1.414 amas, which is a lot less than 2,000 amas. So if I measure the 2,000 amas diagonally to the point, then I'm going to really be losing a lot of space in my tchum. So let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara said, don't measure diagonally from the point of the city northeast or northwest or southeast and southwest. Don't measure the 2,000 amas on the diagonal. If they should not, it's a obvious because you're going to be losing a lot of space because instead of having a radius on all four sides of the city of 2,000 amas, you're only going to get about 1,400 amas, which is a lot less. So what should you do? What you should do is as follows: maybe tabla merubas, get a square, shalpaim amal alpaim amal, umanicha bekeren belachsoina. What does that mean? That means as follows: you have your 2,000 amas that you measured out on each side of the city. So that gave me these four shaded areas that are a square of 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas. And then I take another four squares that are each 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas, and I place them in the four corners that I have not yet filled in yet to create one large square perimeter, which will be my Tchum Shabbos. And we work it out that the diagonal of the square that makes up my city will continue right through the diagonal of our added area for the Tchum, and that makes up my Tchum. Now let's use the Pythagorean theorem to see how far I can actually go from my city if I go diagonally. If I go straight to either side, we already know I can travel 2,000 amas. But we know that the diagonal will give us more space. So let's figure out how much space it is from here all the way to here, which is what I get. And again, we can use the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. So therefore, this is one side of a triangle, or this dotted line is one side of a triangle. This dotted line is the other side of a triangle, a squared and b squared. So this is 2,000 amas, this is 2,000 amas. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 2 is 4. So a squared, which is 4, times b squared, which is 4, plus b squared, which is 4. So 4 plus 4 is 8. So this diagonal line is the square root of 8. What is the square root of 8? Let's use our calculator. Square root 8, 2, 8, 2, 8. So it's about 2,800 amas. It's about 2,800 amas if we're not being precise. It's about 2,800 amas. So really, if I'm going diagonal, I don't get 2,000 amas. I get way more. I get 2,800 amas, which is 800 amas more than the normal 2,000 amas at a tchum. So I benefited that. I've also benefited this little triangle in here when I circumscribe the square around the circle. So if we want to blow it up, we can look at this larger picture here. I started off with a city that was this circle. When I circumscribed the square around it, I ended up adding 400 amas. I added 400 amas that I can travel. So these 400 amas are a bonus due to me because the Rabbanan said when you create a tchum, make an imaginary square around that circle. So in that way, they granted me 400 amas in additional to the 2,000 amas that I would have otherwise had. And then they also told me that when I measure the 2,000 amas, I measure them at right angles. That means my diagonal won't be 2,000 amas. It'll be 2,800 amas. So I got an extra 800 amas here. So based on that, I got an extra 400 amas here. I got an extra 800 amas here. In total, I actually got an extra 1,200 amas that I can go in this direction and in every other direction as well. And that's how the Gemara appears us. Zog the Gemara, umanicha bekeren balachsoina, you put that square, you get 4 squares to fill in the 4 outer corners. Nimtzas it comes out. Ha'ir mistakeres arba meis amos lakan, v'arba meis amos lakan. Since I drew the square around the circle, now on either of the 4 corners, I'm benefiting with an extra 400 amas. And nimzut chumin mistakrid ches meis ama lakan u'shmoine meis ama lakan. And the tchum, like we said, being that I'm going on a diagonal, instead of just going 2,000 amas, I can go 2,800 amas. So I've gained an extra 800 amas. So between the fact that I've squared the tchum and the fact that I squared the city, nimto irbat tchumin mistakrin elef umasayim lakan, the elef umasayim lakan. So now I actually got an extra 1,200 amas of distance in each direction. Omar Abai, and this calculation that we made was based on the city umishkaklas lebamasa david trey alfe a trey alfe. The city that we're talking about was a city That's 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas, because this was all based on the radius of our circle being 1,000 amas, which means from end to end would have been 2,000 amas. And that takes us to the end of this sugya. But I want to point out something that's extremely important. The Gemara didn't have the mathematical accurate formulas like we have. So the Gemara is basing everything on approximations. And there's two different approximations that the Gemara relies on for what we just discussed, that in fact have no connection to each other. And our formulas to figure out each of these two problems are completely different. And I want to highlight them. The first thing our Gemara discussed was the fact that when you put a square around a circle, it adds 25%. So I want to analyze that a little bit. When you're looking to figure out the area of a circle, we know we have a formula called pi. Pi r squared is the area of a circle, which means if I take r, which is the radius, so a circle that has a diameter of 2,000 amas has a radius of 1,000 amas. So if I take r and I square it, which is 1,000 times 1,000, I get a million. And then I multiply that million by pi. So 1 million times 3.1415 is going to be 1 million, and I'll actually do it, 1 million times 3.1415. All we're really doing is moving the decimal place. You get 3,141,500. That would be the area of the circle. Now the Gemara doesn't use pi. The Gemara estimates. So the Gemara says it's approximately 3 times the radius, which is 3.14 is close enough to 3. So basically the Gemara says that whenever you have a circle with a radius of 1, your square amas, your area will be 3. So that's why this circle has an area of 3. Then the Gemara tells us when you circumscribe a square around it, it adds 25%. But that 25% is milagav, meaning after you add that area, it's going to come out that if you add together these 4 corners, it's going to add up to 1. So if this circle was 3 square amas or 3 million square amas, it doesn't matter how many zeros, we'll just keep it simple. If this square was 3 square amas, then this little area here adds in total 1 square amma, which means that it's 1/4, 25% bigger. Or once you look at the square area represents 25% of the total area. That's one way to look at it. And again, we're dealing with the approximations because it's not pi, we're using the number 3. The other way to look at it is milabar, which means that if you take this circle, which is 3 square amas, so you divide it by 3, there's 3 parts. If you take one of those 3 parts, meaning you take a third, which is 1 square amma, and you add it on top, and you get a total of 4 square amas, that's what you'll get when you have your square. So they both mean the same thing. In either case, once you have everything combined, once you have your square there, the extra space around the circle represents 25% of the entire area. Another way to figure it out is if you have your circle, you'll divide the area of your circle by 3. So if I have a circle with an area of 3 and I divide it by 3, I get 1. And when I put a square around it, it's going to add that 1 square amma to the area of the circle. It's the same thing, but it's just whether you're expressing an interior fraction or an exterior fraction. That's one rule. Now there's another rule that mathematically has 0 connection to the rule we just discussed. And that is the rule of the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now, the Pythagorean theorem works no matter what type of right triangle you have. But we're focusing on the square. So we're focusing on the right triangle where the two 90-degree sides are actually equal. So in the case of a box that's 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas, the two sides that intersect at 90 degrees are each 2,000 amas. Again, we're going to get rid of the zeros. We're going to stick to 2. Each 2,000 amas. Using the Pythagorean theorem, we said that a squared, 2, a squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. b squared 2 times 2, which is 4. So a squared plus b squared equals 8. The square root of 8 was 2828. Again, the Gemara approximates it 2800. The Gemara says you basically add 40%. Whenever you have a square, the diagonal line that intersects the square diagonally will be 40% longer than one of its flat sides. And that's where you get 28 from. If this is 2000, this is 2800. Now, the fact that this is 40% bigger than this line has absolutely nothing to do with the relationship between a circle and the square that's circumscribed around it. There are two individual rules. The Gemara is going to, at a point, confuse them and have to clarify that they're two separate rules. But to us, it's quite obvious that they're two separate rules, they're two separate formulas, and one has nothing to do with the other. Okay, now that we've set that straight, let's approach the next subject. Now, the Gemara, using a city that was 2 amas by 2 amas, 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas, the Gemara explained how the Tchumen works, and that's the Gemara we just learned. Now the Gemara wants to apply some of the principles we learned to try to unravel another mystery that the Gemara encountered. And this mystery is the mystery of how we assess the cities that the Leviim were granted. So let's look at the pasuk. The pasuk, when it discusses the cities of the Leviim, says, "Umigrishei ha'arim asher titnu la'Leviim mikir ha'ir b'chutza elef ama saviv." The cities, the areas around the cities that we've given the Leviim, we give them a ribbon that's 1,000 amos deep all the way around their city. And this migrash, the Meforshim tell us, had to be kept empty because it's beautiful for a city if there's no congestion around its walls, if it's just an open, flat area. That makes a city beautiful. So these cities of the Leviim had 1,000 amos all the way around it that had nothing on it. And then further out, they could have had trees, and they could have had farms, or whatever they had. But right up against the wall, a ribbon 1,000 amos all the way around was left bare. Of course, the cities of Leviim have Tchumen too. And they have all the halachas of Tchumen. So let's see how this plays out. Zokt Ahelig Gemara. Tanya, Amar Belezer Bar Yosy, Tchum Are Leviim, the Tchum of the Leviim city, Alpayim Amma, like every other city, they get 2,000 amas. Say Mehen Elef Amma Migrish. Now, 2,000 amas is a virtual ribbon path of 2,000 amas all the way around the city. Now, that ribbon is 2,000 amas deep. 1,000 amas, the 1,000 amas closest to the city is Migrash. You're not allowed to plant anything there. So if I ask you what percentage of that path was Migrash, I would say approximately 50%. Because if the path is 2,000 amas wide and 1,000 amas is Migrash, Migrash represents approximately 50% of this path. Well, that's not what the Brisa says. The Brisa says Nimtza Migrash Revia. The Migrash is only 25% of the area around the city. Ashar Sadas Ukram. And this is going to be the mystery that the Gemara is going to try to decipher. How does this path, which is 1,000 amas wide, how does it represent only 25%? How do we know this halacha about the Migrash being 1,000 amas and the Tchum is 2,000 amas? Zok Gemara, we know it from the pasuk that we just read. Amar Rabbi Amar Kra Mikira Ir Bechutza Elef Amasav. Amar Torah, the Torah taught us, Sabei V'Sa'ir Be'elef. Surround the city, circle the city with a path that's 1,000 amas wide. Nimtza, it comes out that Migrash Revia. The Migrash will be 25% of the path. Frank, the Gemara, Revia, 25%, Palgahava. We just discussed that if the path is 2,000 amas wide and 1,000 amas of that is Migrash, so then the Migrash represents half of the area, not 25% of the area. Amar Rava Bar Ada, so Rava Bar Ada said, Mishucha Asberli, a surveyor explained to me how they arrived at this idea that it's 25%. And he said as follows: Nishkakas lebemasa davet tre alfe at tre alfe. It's about a city that was 2,000 amas wide by 2,000 amas long, a square city, which is the same size city that we were just discussing when we were assessing the Tchum Shabbos. Now, I want to leave the Gemara for a second, go to the picture to give you an idea of how the Gemara expresses itself. So, let's look at this diagram. The Gemara is going to break down the different areas with different identification. Now, if you notice, when I'm creating my tchum all the way around the city, it includes these squares, and each of these squares represents 1,000 amma by 1,000 amma. So the city is 2,000 ammas by 2,000 ammas, which you can call 4 million square ammas. And each box represents 1,000,000 square ammas. So we can use 1,000,000 square ammas, or we can use the word a box. Either way, it means the same thing, because each box in the diagram represents 1,000,000 square ammas. So if I take my city, that's 4 million square ammas, along each of its four walls, I have to create a zone that's 2,000 ammas deep, because that's how far the Tchum Shabbos is, by 2,000 ammas wide, because that's how big the wall is. So I'm creating the Tchum for them with 4 million square ammas, or four boxes. I do four of those: 1, 2, 3, 4, one for each wall of the city. But we know that the Tchum also extends diagonally. So we have to add another four boxes, and each of these four boxes also represents 4 million square ammas. When the Gemara describes the four boxes that are adjacent to the walls, the Gemara calls those the Tchum. When the Gemara talks about the four boxes that are in the corners, the Gemara calls it the Kronos. So that will help us understand what the Gemara is referring to when the Gemara uses the word Tchumen and Kronos. Tchumen refers to the areas that we add right alongside the walls, and then the corners that we add, those are called the Kronos. So before we get to the Gemara, let's do this very simply and mathematically. Each of these boxes represent, each of the small boxes is 1 square amma, is 1,000 square ammas, and the four boxes represent 4,000 square ammas. 4,000 square ammas is 4,000 times 4,000 is 16 million square ammas. So this is going to be 16 million square ammas. I apologize. This is 2 by 2. This is 2,000 ammas by 2,000 ammas. So this represents 4 million square ammas. Each box, each small box represents 1 million square ammas, and each four boxes represents 4 million square ammas. So let's look at how many square ammas we have once it's all filled in. Once it's all filled in, I have 4 at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to have 8 boxes, and each of these larger boxes represents 4 million square ammas. 8 times 4 is 32. I have 32 million square ammas, plus the 4 million square ammas that represent the city itself. So if I look at this entire grid here, there's 36 million square ammas, or 36 little boxes. So in total, my square is 36 little boxes, but the area around the city, excluding the four boxes of the city, is 32 boxes, or 32 million square ammas. So let's have a look over here. The entire area is 32 million square ammas. Now let's look at the area that would be Midrash. The Midrash only extends 1,000 ammas away from the city, which means on either side you'd have 2 boxes: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now on the Tchum, on each side of the city, the Midrash would be 8 million square ammas, but we need to fill in the four corners: 1, 2, 3, 4, which means the Midrash would really represent 12 million square ammas, or 12 boxes. We already decided that the entire area around this whole Tchum was 32 million square ammas. So if the Midrash is 12 million square ammas and the whole area is 32 million square ammas, 12 is even more than a third of 32. So we have a problem. How is this 12 representing 25% of the whole area when it's the whole area is 32 boxes or 32 million square amas, and the midrash around we calculated is 12 million. 12 into 32 is less than 3. So it's definitely not a quarter. And that is what the Gemara is going to struggle with. So let's have the Gemara here. Amar Rabba Barada, Mishucha. Mishucha Asberli, the surveyors explained to me. Mishkakas lebamasa diabetre alpha ya tre alpha. You have a city that's 2,000 amos by 2,000 amos. Tchum kama havia. How much is the tchum? Meaning you have to put a box. You have to put 4 boxes on each side, which is 4 times 4, which is 16 million square amos. So tchum kama havia sitzer. That's going to be 16 million square amos, which are these 4 boxes, these 4, these 4, these 4. We have 16. Then we have the 4 kronis, which are another 16. So therefore we have as follows. Tchum kamahava shitzer. Corners kamahava, the 4 boxes and the 4 corners, how much are they? Sitzer. That's a total of 32. That's the entire area of the tchum. Now let's look what the area of the midrash is. Dal tamanya the tchumen. There's 2 boxes on each side, which represent 8 million square amas, that are the midrash, that are parallel to each of the 4 walls. And then you still need 4 more to represent the corners. Ba'arba the kronos, and another 4 million square amas to represent the corners, which is a total of 12. Kababa tracer. So you have your midrash, which is 12 million square amas. You have your whole area, which is 32 million square amas. Nimsa midrash revia. You're telling me that the midrash ends up being a quarter? 12 into 32 is even more than a third. So that can't be the explanation. So let's try a plan B. I see Arba de Masa. When we counted the 32 million square amas, we were not including the 4 million square amas of the city itself. We were only talking about the area that's come around the city. So let's add to the mix the extra 4 million square amas. And now the total mass is 36 million square amas, or 36 boxes. So we have 12 into 36. 12 into 36 is not a quarter either. Shadi alayu akati tilsava. 12 into 36 is a third. It's not a quarter. So how can you possibly explain the brisa that says that the midrash represents only a quarter, 25% of the rest of the area? Zok Gemara. Who said that the city that we were discussing with by the Levi was a square city? B'Gulukam, it was a round city, similar to the city that we discussed when we were looking at the Tchum Shabbos. And we artificially fill in those 4 corners. But for the midrash, you don't do that. Where do you fill in the 4 corners artificially? That's when you're measuring the Tchum Shabbos. But for the purpose of making the midrash, that 1,000 amma path around the city, there we don't necessarily add and make the circle into a square. So now let's figure this out. How much can we take away? We had calculated originally around the square, the midrash, we calculated 12 boxes or 12 million square amas. But really, it shouldn't be that many because I don't have to go around the whole square. That's 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas. I only have to go around the circle. That's 2,000 amas. So let's figure out what the difference will be. We had a rule. Kama meruba yeser ala eagle. How much does the square circumscribed around the circle add an area? Revia. We said it adds 25%. So if that's how much it adds, let's take the 12 and let's take 25% away from it. Dal revia minayu. If you take 25% away from 12, you're remaining with 9. Pashulutisha. You have 9 million square amas as the area that's the ribbon around the round city. Vitisha, mitlas and vishisa, and it's the full amount of the entire area we said earlier is 36 boxes or 36 million square amas. 9 from 36, ribahava, is 25%, which is perfect. That's the number we were looking for. Abaya said, I'll have a different approach to explain the brisa. And I won't say like you, that we're talking about a city that's 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas, I'm going to talk about a city that's smaller, much smaller. Omar, Abai Omar Mishkachas Lo Nami B'Maso Dava Alpha Balf. We're talking about a city that's only 1,000 amas by 1,000 amas. So it's 1 million square amas instead of 4 million square amas. So now let's figure how the chips are going to fall. So before we learn the Gemara inside, let's go to the pictures so that we get clarity. In this case, for the Tchum Shabbos, each of the four walls are only 1,000 amas. So because of that, we're only going to create a strip that's 1,000 amas wide. But a Tchum still extends out 2,000 amas. So if I look at what my Tchum Shabbos is, on each four sides, I get 2 million square amas because there's two boxes here, two boxes here, two boxes here, and two boxes here. Or 2,000 by 1,000, which is 2 million square amas. So 2, 4, 6, 8. I have 8 million square amas, but I still have to fill in the corners for Tchum Shabbos. So I still have to add another four boxes that are each 16. That are each 4 million square amas. So if I have 4 million square amas here, 4 million square amas here, 4 million here, and 4 million here, that gives me 16 million square amas, or 16 little boxes, plus the 8 square boxes, or the 8 million square amas that these strips gave me, and 16 plus 8 is 24. So the entire area is now 24 million square amas. Let's look at what the Midrash will give me. The Midrash gives me 1,000 square amas on each side. That's 4 million square amas. But I have to add another 4 for the corners, which would be 8 million square amas. So I have 24 million square amas of total area, and my Midrash around this smaller city is 8 million square amas. What's 8 into 24? It's 3. So it's a third. It's not a quarter. And that's the first problem the Gemara is going to encounter. How much are the tchumen, which are the 4 strips that represent the tchum? Tamanya, there would be a total of 8 million square amas, or 8 boxes of 1,000 by 1,000. Kuranis kamihava, the 4 corners are still 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas each, which adds a total of 16. So I have 16 for the corners, 8 for each of the 4 sides. That's 24. Now, let's subtract from that. Let's see how much of that is the Midrash. Dal arba de tchumen. There's going to be on each side for the Midrash, there's going to be 1,000 amas square. That's 4. So far, that's 4 million square amas. Arba de kramis and another 4 squares for the corners, which is 8. Kami avet tmanya. So if I have 8 million square amas of Midrash, and I have 24 million square amas of total tchum area, Tilsava, it's only a third. Again, I don't have 25%. Zok the Gemara, mi sovris birevua ka'amar. Who said that we're talking about a city that's a square, 1,000 amas by 1,000 amas? Bi'igulu ka'amar. Maybe we're talking about a city that's round and it has a diameter of 1,000 amas, which is similar to what we said in the last shot. And therefore, kama meruba yeser ala oval, the same calculation. We know that the area of a square is larger than the area of a circle by Revia by 25%. So I was counting 8 million square amas, 8 boxes with a migrash around the city. Let's take away 25%. Dal Revia. If I reduce 8 by 25%, I'm left with 6. Pashlushita. So now I'm perfect. I have 6 million square amas, or 6 boxes that represent the midrash. I have a total area of 24. The shita michav dalid ribahava. 6 is 25% of 24. So that's a second approach to explain how it is that the midrash is 25% of the entire tchum area. We have the first shot that there's the original city is 4 million square amas, 2,000 by 2,000. And we have a biased shot that, I believe the first one is a Yosy, then we have a biased shot that the city is 1,000 amas by 1,000 amas. which is 1,000,000 square amas. Now we have another pshat. We're going to actually have two more pshat. Ravina said, my Revia de Tchumen. When we said we're really speaking about the original case where you have a square city, not a round city. And the square city is 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas. So, how is it that you have one quarter? Zok Ravida, I'm not calculating the corners. I'm only calculating the sides. So let's go back to our picture and we'll see how that relates. What Rava is telling us is I'm not counting these corners. I'm only counting the sides. So when I'm looking at the Migrish on the sides, I have 2, 4, 6, 8. I have 8,000,000 square amas. The entire Tchum, we said, was 32,000,000 square amas. 8 square amas into 32 is exactly 25%. That's how Ravina learns. And the next shot that the Gemara offers is the svara of Rabashi. Rabashi says exactly the opposite. Rabashi said that we ignore the tchumen, we're only looking at the corners. So again, when I look at the corners, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm comparing them to the rest of the area of the corner. So in each corner, the tchum included 4,000,000 square amas, but the little square that represented the migrash was only 1,000,000 square amas. So in each of these 4 squares, there's 4 sets of 4 squares, which are 16, and there's only 4 of them that are part of the migrash. 4 out of 16 is exactly 25%, and that's why you have 25%. And those are the 4 different pshatim offered to explain how the migrash represented 25% of the rest of the area. Rabashi Yomer my Revia de Kronis. The 4 squares of 1,000 amma by 1,000 amma that are the migrash of the corners of this city are 25% of what the area would be in each corner for the Tchum Shabbos. Omer Ravina Ravashi. Ravina told Ravashi, I don't like your pshat because v'hasaviv ksiv. The lashon haposuk when it's discussing the migrash ha'arim, it says saviv, and saviv normally means the walls, not the corners. Dr. Bashi, that's not true. My saviv is saviv the kronis. Saviv doesn't have to refer to the flat wall. Saviv might refer to the corner itself, the point. And I'll prove it to you from the Torah where it describes the zrikas domim for carbon chatos. We all know the zrikas domim for the carbon chatos was on the kronis, on the 4 corners of the mizbeach. But look what the pasuk says. V'shach hadas ben abakar lefnei Hashem v'ikrivu b'nei Aaron akaydim es adam v'zark or sadam al mizbeach saviv. So it uses the word saviv to describe the corner of the mizbeach. Dichsev v'zarku es adam al mizbeach saviv. Hachadami saviv mamish. You, Ravina, want to suggest that saviv in that pasuk means this the wall? Of course not. It means the corner. Elamai saviv the kronos. Clearly, saviv in the pasuk speaking about the zrikas dam of the carbon chatos is speaking about the corners. Hachanami, so too when our pasuk talks about the migrash ha'arim, my saviv the kronos, it's talking about the points, and that's what the Brisa is referring to, and that's why I learned the Brisa to mean that the corners of the migrash represent 25% of the corner of the entire tchum. Period. Now we have 2 more little points related to what we just learned that the Gemara is going to raise. So let's think a second. We have a city based on, we're going back to the svara of the first 2 terutzim where we're dealing with a round city. The city is round. We know that you need to make a migrash around it, which is a 1,000 amma path that should have nothing growing in it. But the problem is, since halachically, l'gabet Chum Shabbos, we put a square around the circle, and we're saying that every single part inside the square is built up. In other words, halachically, it's virtually built up, and we treat it like a city. It comes out that in those 4 corners, we're considering them halachically built up, even though the Torah says those areas must remain unbuilt up. So we're halachically building up and putting houses virtual houses into a city, into an area of the city that's supposed to be the ribbon of the Midrash that's not supposed to have anything built there. Well, you can worship the Karnasa, the Masa Gulta. The Gemara, we can worship the Karnasa. We have the areas of the points. So Gemara Masa Gulta, we're talking about a round city. But the problem is we halachically made it into a square, meaning those areas now halachically have virtual houses there. How could that be allowed? So Gemara, what are you talking about? Amor Damri and Chazin and Command Marba. Halachically, look at Tchum Shabbos, we look at it like it's built up, like it's part of the city. But Ribuah Vada Nimar Vada, of course, we don't actually build houses there. We can't actually build houses there because that's technically part of the Midrash. But we still consider that within the confines of the city to create our square city for the purposes of Tchum Shabbos. That's the first question. The next question the Gemara is going to ask is something that I prefaced a little earlier, and I'm going to review it again so that this Gemara becomes very easy to understand. If you remember, we discussed that the relationship between the square and the circle is you take the area of the circle, which was 3, which is a rough estimate of pi. You divide it by 3, you get 1. You take that 1 and you add it to it, and that gets you the 4, which is the total area of the square. So basically, it's 1/3 of milabar. I take 1/3 of my original area, I add it to the area, and now the added area becomes 1/4 of the entire area. But I'm taking 1/3 of my original area. Now, if you remember, I said that this calculation of the relationship between a circle and a square has nothing to do with the relationship of the diagonal of a square to its flat line. However, the Gemara at this point doesn't understand the difference. So the Gemara is asking, if over here you take 1/3 of this area and you add it to it to make the square, well, why did you do the same thing over here? This dimension, the straight dimension, was 2,000 amas. So if the straight dimension is 2,000 amas, then I should take 1/3 of 2,000 amas, which is 666.666, and that's what I should add to the 2,000 amas for the diagonal. So why do you say the diagonal is 2,800? The diagonal should really be 2,666. So I should only be adding 666 amas instead of 800 amas. Now, of course, from our math, using the Pythagorean theorem, we know that this makes no sense at all. It's not mathematically just at all. But the Gemara didn't have the Pythagorean theorem. The Gemara was just estimating. So the Gemara thought that the estimation of the relationship of the circle to the square should be similar to the estimation of the diagonal line to the straight line. So Zok the Gemara. Zok the Gemara, Armalei Rab Chaniloi Michaznol Rabachi Michti. Kama Maruba Yesra Lagal Revia. Since when you're looking at the difference in size between a square that's circumscribed around the circle and the circle itself, you take 1/3 of the area of the circle and you add it to create the square. Well, if that's the case, let's take 1/3 of the 2,000 amas and add it to make the diagonal. So Hani Tamni Meya, why do we say you add 800 to 2,000 and the diagonal line is 2,800? It should be Shish Meya Vishishin Visheva Nachitilsa. Have it. It should be 666.666. Amarlei. So Rav Ashi told Rabbi Chaniloi, you better go back to learn your high school math, your high school geometry. That ratio of adding 1/3 bilabar, that's to figure out the difference in area between a circle and a square. When you're using the formula to try to explain the hypotenuse, it's a completely different formula. And you're mixing up your formulas. You're trying to use a formula made for circles and squares to apply to a diagonal intersection of a square, and they have nothing to do with each other. Anytime you have a square that's 2 amas by 2 amas, its diagonal will be an additional 40%. And that's why the 2,000 by 2,000, its diagonal was 2,800, which is an additional 40%. Of course, it's not exact. We cheshbon with the Pythagorean theorem that it was 28.28, but again, the Gemara works with approximations, and as an approximation, that would be the formula. And with that, we could finish Today, Shir Baruch Hashem, we got through some very difficult Gemara. Thank you so much and have a wonderful, wonderful day.